A simple black woman was ignored at the range until her first shot shattered a champion's record. The sun blazed high over the dusty shooting range in the quiet outskirts of Pine Valley. Gunshots echoed through the air as competitors lined up at their stations, each one dressed in tactical gear, their confidence as loud as the booms from their rifles. It was the state-level marksmanship tournament, and the crowd had come expecting to see veterans and champions defend their titles. No one paid much attention to the woman who quietly walked in wearing a plain denim jacket, her hair wrapped in a vibrant scarf, and a calm, humble presence about her. Her name was Nadine Carter, a name no one recognized. No fancy sponsor logos on her clothes, no press team, and certainly no crowd of admirers. In a place where appearances shouted louder than skill, Nadine's simplicity was invisible. "Ma'am, are you lost?" a young assistant asked politely, his tone more patronizing than concerned. "No, I'm here to compete," she replied, pulling out her registration papers. He blinked, surprised, then directed her toward the waiting area without another word. The other shooters snickered when Nadine unpacked her gear, an old but well-maintained rifle, its wood polished, and its barrel gleaming in the sunlight. It wasn't one of the new, high-end precision rifles that most of the competitors flaunted. "Looks like Grandma brought her antique," one of them muttered. Nadine heard it, but said nothing. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here for the shot. As she took her place on the firing line, the announcer barely acknowledged her name. All eyes were on the reigning champion, Brett Lawson, a former Marine with 3 state titles under his belt. Cameras zoomed in on him as he adjusted his scope with calculated ease. When Nadine lay prone and adjusted her sight, a hush fell, not because they expected greatness, but because they anticipated a quick failure. The timer began.
Bang!
The first shot cracked through the silence. The crowd looked up at the digital board in confusion. A perfect bullseye. Not just perfect, it registered a margin so tight, so dead center, that it beat Brett Lawson's record from last year by 2 full points. There was silence. Then murmurs. Then the officials rushed to the monitors, checking for a malfunction. Nadine stayed still, waiting for the timer to restart. Her next shot landed just the same. Then another. And another. By the time she finished the round, the scoreboard read what nobody could believe, a new record. A score so high, the previous champion hadn't even come within 10 points of it. The announcer finally said her name, this time with awe. Nadine Carter has just shattered the Pine Valley record. Brett Lawson stood stunned. His hands hung loose by his sides, his face pale with disbelief. He wasn't used to being outgunned, especially not by a quiet woman no one had heard of before. The crowd erupted into applause. Those who had ignored her moments ago now pushed forward, wanting a photo, a handshake, anything to be part of her moment. Still calm, still quiet, Nadine stood up, dusted off her pants, and packed her rifle. A reporter asked the inevitable question, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She smiled faintly. "My father taught me back on our farm. We didn't have trophies. Just cans on a fence and time to learn." As she walked away from the crowd, who now watched her with reverence, one young girl in the audience turned to her mother and whispered, "I want to be like her." Because in that moment, Nadine Carter wasn't just a competitor. She was a reminder that greatness doesn't wear labels, and sometimes the quietest ones carry the loudest impact. It was a hot Saturday morning at the Dust Rock firing range, where the state's most elite sharpshooters gathered for the annual Pine Valley Marksmanship Tournament. The parking lot was packed with armor trucks, custom rifle cases, and men and women clad in military-grade tactical gear. The event was buzzing with media crews, spectators, and sponsors handing out merchandise to local favorites. Among them were known names, champions, former Marines, tactical instructors, each one with a loyal following, each one there to prove they were the best. No one noticed the rusted-out pickup truck that pulled into the far end of the lot, nor did they notice the woman who stepped out of it. She wore plain jeans, scuffed boots, and a sun-faded denim jacket. A red and yellow scarf wrapped her hair neatly, and a soft, unreadable look sat quietly on her face. Her name was Nadine Carter, and, to the rest of the world, she might have looked out of place. She carried no sponsor badges, no expensive equipment, and no fanfare. What she did carry, however, was a long, weathered rifle in a soft case, a weapon that had seen more dust than most of the guns there had seen bullets. When she stepped up to the registration table, the volunteer barely looked at her before asking, "Are you here to watch someone?" There was no malice in his voice, just the assumption, as easy as breathing, that she couldn't possibly be a competitor. "I'm here to shoot," Nadine replied, her voice calm, her eyes unwavering. After a moment of awkward silence and a check of her registration papers, she was quietly added to the list. The other competitors chuckled as she passed. One of them, a tall man in a digital camo suit with wraparound sunglasses, leaned over to his friend and whispered, "Looks like the local mom wandered in." His friend snorted. Nadine heard them, but didn't flinch. She had been ignored before, underestimated before, and she'd long since learned not to waste her breath correcting anyone's assumptions. The competition began with fanfare. Cameras swiveled to catch the reigning champion, Brett Lawson, as he adjusted the scope on his custom rifle. Brett was a decorated Marine sniper, a 3-time winner of the Pine Valley Cup, and a local hero in the shooting community. With every shot, his fans clapped, already predicting another flawless performance. Around Nadine, others boasted about their gear: carbon fiber stocks, laser-assisted sights, match-grade barrels. Her own rifle, a bolt-action .308 Winchester, looked like it belonged in a museum. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, but its bore was clean, its mechanics pristine. When Nadine's name was called, there was barely a murmur. No applause. No attention. Just a few curious glances and a few stifled chuckles. She walked to the firing line with the same grace she'd walked to church with as a child. She lay prone on the mat, adjusted the strap on her rifle, and looked through the scope. The entire range was quiet, everyone waiting to see her fail quickly so they could return to the real competition. Then came the shot. A single crack echoed through the air. And then confusion. The score monitor beeped and flashed. People leaned forward. The target read dead center, an almost mathematically perfect bullseye, the kind that calculators dream of and shooters chase their whole lives. Some thought it was a mistake. The officials huddled around the equipment, checking for errors. But the score stood. Nadine pulled the bolt back, loaded another round, and fired again. Another bullseye. The crowd stirred. People turned their heads. The competitors looked up from their scopes. Brett Lawson squinted across the range, trying to see what the sudden commotion was about. Shot after shot, Nadine's performance remained flawless. Each one was delivered with the quiet patience of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting a skill not for trophies, but for something far deeper. By the time her round was over, the scoreboard flashed a total that shattered the previous record by nearly 10 points. Silence fell. Then whispers. Then a roar. Nadine stood up, brushed the dust from her knees, and began to pack her rifle. A reporter sprinted over, practically breathless. "Ma'am, that was incredible. Where did you train? Who taught you to shoot like that?" She paused, smiled, and answered softly, "My daddy taught me. Back home, in Mississippi. We didn't have money for much, but we had time and patience and a field full of empty cans." Brett Lawson approached, his hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He nodded once, respectfully. "That was the best shooting I've ever seen," he said. Nadine nodded back. "Thank you," she replied. Nothing more needed to be said. As she walked away, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Some clapped. Others looked stunned. But one thing was certain, no one ignored her anymore. In a world obsessed with appearances, flashy gear, and loud confidence, Nadine Carter had walked in with none of those things. She had been overlooked, underestimated, and almost laughed off the field. But in a matter of minutes, she reminded everyone that real skill doesn't need validation. It doesn't wear fancy uniforms or speak loud. It simply speaks through action, one perfect shot at a time. The sun beat down relentlessly on the cracked earth of the Dust Rock firing range, where the biggest names in the world of marksmanship had gathered for the state's annual championship. It was a tradition as old as the town itself, A chance for the best shooters to display their skills and win bragging rights that would last for another year. Rows of spectators sat on bleachers shaded by faded awnings, their sunglasses reflecting the flashes of sunlight off the polished barrels of precision rifles. Vendors sold cold lemonade and hot dogs, while reporters lugged heavy cameras across the lot, hungry for a good story. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder, sunscreen, and competition. Everyone there knew the players. Brett Lawson, the three-time champion and ex-Marine, Tommy "Hawkeye" Daniels, the sniper legend, Elena Ramirez, the rising star sponsored by Top Gun manufacturers. Every name carried weight. Every face was known. That's why when Nadine Carter arrived, nobody looked twice. She wasn't flashy. She wasn't loud. Nadine wore a simple denim jacket faded by too many summers, old brown work boots, and jeans that had seen better days. Her hair was tucked neatly beneath a brightly colored scarf, and the only thing she carried was a soft, worn rifle case slung over one shoulder. As she made her way toward the registration table, some folks glanced at her in passing, but no one lingered. No reporters snapped her photo. No fans asked for autographs. The volunteers manning the sign-in booth looked puzzled when she approached, as if they were trying to figure out whether she was lost or looking for someone else. One of the younger assistants, a boy barely out of high school, cleared his throat awkwardly. Ma'am, spectators gotta stay behind the lines." Nadine gave a patient smile, pulling a folded registration sheet from her jacket pocket. "I'm here to shoot," she said, her voice smooth and steady. The boy flushed red as he checked her paperwork. Everything was in order. He mumbled an apology and handed her a competitor badge without meeting her eyes. Nadine nodded politely and moved on, unfazed. She had not driven 3 hours across dusty backroads to make friends or be admired. She had come for one thing: to shoot. The other competitors noticed her then, but only in that casual, dismissive way that people notice a misplaced piece of furniture. A few men snickered behind their hands. One woman nudged her partner and whispered something that made him chuckle. Nadine didn't let it touch her. She had heard worse. She had lived through worse. Words, after all, were only noise. Out beyond the shooting line, beyond the taunts and the judgment, lay the one thing that never lied: the target. As the preliminary round started, Nadine sat alone on a bench near the edge of the lot, methodically cleaning her rifle. It was a bolt-action Winchester .308, the kind of weapon that had long since been outclassed by modern competition models. Its wooden stock was scarred from decades of use, and the bluing on the barrel had faded to a smoky gray. But Nadine's hands moved over it with the reverence of a daughter tending her father's grave. She checked the sights, ran a cloth through the bore, and whispered under her breath, the way she always did before a match. It wasn't a prayer. It was a conversation between her, her rifle, and the memory of all those mornings spent learning to shoot in the misty fields of Mississippi under her father's careful eye. The announcer's voice boomed across the range, calling shooters to the line for the first real event of the day. Names flashed across the digital scoreboard. Cheers went up as familiar favorites took their positions. Brett Lawson, in full tactical gear, adjusted his expensive scope and gave a confident smirk to the cameras. He was the man to beat, and he knew it. Spectators jostled for a better view. Nadine's name, when it came, was read with a barely concealed yawn. Nadine Carter. Station 16. No one clapped. No one moved. The cameraman focused elsewhere. Nadine walked to her station without fanfare. She knelt, spread her mat, and lay down, her body settling into the earth like it belonged there. Around her, competitors fiddled with high-tech gadgets, whispered strategies, and posed for photographers. Nadine simply adjusted her scope, took a slow breath, and waited for the signal. When it came, she moved without hesitation. Crack. The first shot rang out, a sharp, clean sound that seemed to echo a little longer than the others. For a moment, no one noticed. Then the digital board lit up. A perfect bullseye. Not just close, dead center. The sort of shot statisticians said was technically possible, but so rare it was nearly a myth. Officials leaned over their monitors, double-checking. Spectators shaded their eyes, squinting at the distant paper target. Murmurs rippled through the stands. Brett Lawson glanced sideways, frowning. Nadine remained still. She cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and fired again. Crack. Another perfect shot. By the fifth shot, the murmuring had turned to stunned silence. Heads turned. Cameras swiveled. People stood up in the bleachers. Officials whispered to each other in urgent tones. Someone even ran to double-check the calibration of the scoring system. But there was no error. There was only Nadine Carter, moving with the slow, sure precision of a woman who had spent her whole life preparing for a moment like this. By the end of her round, Nadine hadn't just broken the course record. She had obliterated it. Her score was so far ahead of the next best competitor that it barely seemed real. Brett Lawson's jaw tightened as he realized his reign was over, not at the hands of another decorated Marine or sponsored hotshot, but by a woman no one had seen coming, a woman most of them hadn't even bothered to notice. When Nadine stood and slung her rifle over her shoulder, the crowd finally erupted. Applause crashed through the stands like a wave. Reporters scrambled over each other, desperate to get to her. Children leaned over the railing, waving. Grown men stared in open-mouthed awe. A reporter shoved a microphone in her face. "Miss Carter, where did you learn to shoot like that? Who trained you? Are you part of a professional team?" Nadine smiled faintly, her eyes calm. "My daddy taught me. Back home. We didn't have much. Just an old rifle, some empty soda cans, and a lot of afternoons." Another reporter pushed forward. "Are you planning to go pro now? With talent like that, you could make a fortune." Nadine shook her head slowly. "I didn't come here for money. I came here for the shot." She turned and walked away, leaving the reporters and the flashing cameras behind. As she made her way across the range, a little girl broke free from the crowd and ran after her, clutching a scrap of paper and a pen. Nadine knelt down and signed it, ruffling the child's hair before moving on. Behind her, the murmurs grew. Stories would be told about that day, about the quiet woman who came out of nowhere and proved that greatness didn't have a face, or a uniform, or a pedigree. It lived in the heart, in the hands, and in the relentless belief that skill is skill, no matter who you are. And Nadine Carter? She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the fame. She already had everything she came for, the shot, and the silence it left behind. The sky hung low with thick gray clouds as Nadine Carter pulled into the parking lot of the Redstone shooting complex. Her truck, an old Ford with a cracked windshield and rust creeping along the fenders, coughed to a stop between two gleaming new SUVs. As she killed the engine, the familiar knot twisted in her stomach, the same one she felt every time she entered a space where she was not expected, where she was not wanted. But she brushed the feeling aside, picked up her weathered canvas rifle case, and stepped onto the blacktop. Inside, the complex was buzzing. Shooters in tactical gear moved in small packs, their laughter loud and careless. Vendors hawked the latest scopes and custom triggers. A banner overhead declared, "Redstone Annual Marksman Challenge, Home of Champions." No one noticed Nadine as she weaved through the crowd, her boots silent against the polished concrete. She was a small woman, unassuming, her dark skin luminous under the harsh fluorescent lights. She wore no insignia, no fancy shooting vest, no high-end optics dangling from her neck. To the crowd, she was invisible, just another face blending into the background. At the registration desk, a young clerk barely looked up from his phone. When he did, his eyes flickered over her briefly, clearly unimpressed. "Spectators need to stay behind the yellow line," he said automatically. "I'm here to compete," Nadine said quietly, setting her paperwork on the table. The clerk hesitated, scanning the documents. His brows furrowed slightly, but he said nothing, simply handing her a number, Station 32. Nadine tucked it into her jacket and moved on. As she passed by the clusters of competitors, the murmurs started. A few snickers. A few sidelong glances. Someone muttered, "Hope she knows which end of the barrel the bullet comes out of." The word stung, but Nadine had long ago built armor against such things. She was not here for them. She was here for herself. Out at the range, she found her station, a dusty corner farthest from the viewing stands. Most of the premium spots had gone to the regulars, the ones with sponsorships and social media followings. Nadine set down her mat, unfolded it carefully, and unpacked her rifle. It was an old piece, a Winchester Model 70, heavy and scarred with use. Her father's rifle. Her grandfather's rifle. It had been passed down through generations, cared for with the reverence usually reserved for holy relics. She cleaned it each night as a kind of ritual, whispering the stories it carried like prayers. She settled herself prone, adjusting the butt of the rifle into her shoulder, checking her sight line. Around her, younger shooters were assembling slick, futuristic rifles, lightweight carbines, precision-engineered scopes, monogrammed suppressors. Nadine worked alone, methodically, without flash or fuss. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "Attention, shooters. Round 1 will begin in 5 minutes. Brett Lawson, Station 1. Tyler Crane, Station 2. Nadine Carter, Station 32. There was a brief, puzzled pause at her name. Brett Lawson, the reigning champion, a tall, square-jawed man with mirrored sunglasses and a booming laugh, smirked when he heard it. His friends around him chuckled. "Guess they're letting anyone play today," Brett said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. Nadine said nothing. She simply clicked open her ammunition box, selected a round, and loaded it with the smoothness of long, disciplined practice. The buzzer sounded. Shooters took their positions. Brett fired first, a sharp crack that echoed off the hills behind the range. His shot was good, tight near the center. The spectators hooped and clapped. Nadine exhaled slowly, feeling the tension drain from her fingers. The world around her blurred and shrank until only the target remained, a small, white circle shimmering in the distance. She adjusted for the breeze brushing her left cheek. Her finger curled around the trigger, featherlight. Crack. The sound of her shot was crisp but unremarkable. It was the scoreboard that drew gasps. Dead center. Bullseye. Perfect. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some thought it was luck. A fluke. Brett frowned and fired again, tightening his group. Nadine adjusted slightly, fired a second shot. Crack. Another bullseye. Now people were turning, whispering. Some rose from their seats. Brett glanced down the line towards Station 32, his jaw tightening. Shot after shot, Nadine dismantled every doubt. Her grouping was so tight that the bullet holes merged into a single ragged hole. Officials moved closer, muttering into walkie-talkies. Judges double-checked their screens. Veteran shooters stopped to watch, mouths slightly open. When the buzzer ended the round, the scoreboard blinked and solidified. New range record, Nadine Carter. The crowd erupted in a confused roar. Some cheered wildly. Others stood silent, stunned. Brett Lawson ripped off his sunglasses and stared at the screen, as if willing it to change. It didn't. Nadine rose slowly from her mat, dusted off her knees, and slung the rifle over her shoulder. As she walked back toward the tent, reporters pushed forward, cameras flashing. "Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Are you sponsored? Have you competed nationally?" Nadine smiled faintly, a small, private smile. "No sponsors. No competitions. Just hard work," she said. Her voice was calm, steady. "My daddy taught me to shoot straight. Told me a bullet don't care about your skin, your money, or your name. Just your aim." It was not the answer the crowd expected, but it was the only one she would give. Later, when the awards were presented, Nadine stood on the top podium, a simple medal hanging around her neck. She looked out over the crowd, the stunned faces, the grudging respect, the whispered wonder. In the back, she saw a little black girl, no older than 8, watching her with wide, shining eyes. Nadine gave a small nod. She hadn't come for fame. She hadn't come for trophies. She had come to remind the world, and herself, that greatness has no uniform, no skin color, no pedigree. It is born of patience, passion, and quiet, relentless courage. And as she drove away that night, the medal tucked into her pocket and the rifle laid gently beside her, Nadine Carter left behind not just a broken record, but a legend. One shot at a time. As Nadine drove down the lonely highway away from Redstone, the metal cool against her skin and the rifle resting quietly beside her, the night pressed in on the battered truck like a living thing, but inside Nadine, a fire had been lit, not a blaze of wild glory, but a slow, steady flame that had taken root long ago and now burned with fierce certainty, because it was not enough to have proven herself once, not enough to have shattered records and silenced a crowd. There was still so much more to do, so many places where the world needed to be shown that greatness could bloom from unexpected soil, that pride and perseverance could carve a new path through centuries of stone walls and locked gates. So when the call came the next morning, when a gravel-voiced organizer from the National Open phoned and half apologized, half begged for her to enter the national tournament the following month, Nadine said yes, without hesitation, because she knew deep down that the journey had only just begun, that each shot she fired was not just a bullet through paper, but a blow against the invisible chains still coiled around so many dreams. And so she spent the next weeks in relentless preparation, waking before the sun to run laps around the empty fields behind her house, strengthening her lungs, steadying her breath, sharpening her focus, and when the neighbors saw her lying in the dirt at dawn, practicing dry fire drills with her battered Winchester, they shook their heads and muttered that she was wasting her time, but Nadine ignored them, just as she had ignored the jeers at the range, just as she had ignored every whisper and slight and barrier thrown up in her path since she was a girl. And the night before the Nationals, she loaded the old truck again, checked and double-checked her gear, kissed the photograph of her father tucked inside the glove box, and set off across 3 states, the open road stretching ahead like a promise or a dare, her heart calm, her spirit ready. And when she arrived at the National Complex, a gleaming fortress of modern technology and polished marble floors and banners proclaiming the names of famous champions, she stepped out of her truck into a sea of polished boots, monogrammed jackets, TV cameras, and wary, skeptical eyes, because once again she was an outsider. Once again they sized her up and dismissed her without thought, because they did not yet understand that the quietest flame is often the most enduring, that storms born in silence can shatter mountains. So she registered without fuss, was assigned the lowest-seated starting position, and was given a shooting slot that barely edged into the televised window, practically buried behind the stars and favorites. But Nadine didn't mind. She unpacked her Winchester with the same careful hands, adjusted her sights under the watchful gaze of officials who barely concealed their surprise at her ancient equipment, and when the buzzer sounded, and it was her turn to shoot, she lay down on the coarse mat with the weight of the sky pressing down and the weight of generations lifting her up, and she breathed out slow, breathed out fear, breathed out doubt, and when she pulled the trigger that first time, the sound was like thunder splitting the sky, and the scoreboard blinked once, twice, as if struggling to believe, then flashed a perfect score, and the murmurs began anew, rippling through the ranks of spectators and competitors alike, and Nadine reloaded, adjusted infinitesimally, fired again, and again, and again, each shot stitching a trail of brilliance through the air, and by the time her round ended, the officials were whispering frantically into headsets, the announcer's voice stumbled over itself announcing the historic results, the camera crews sprinted across the field to get closer, because they realized too late they were witnessing something seismic, and Nadine simply stood, dusted off her jeans, slung the rifle over her shoulder, and nodded once to the officials before heading back toward the competitor's tent, leaving chaos in her wake, leaving wide-eyed children pressing against the barricades to glimpse her, leaving sponsors suddenly scrambling to rewrite their assumptions, because Nadine Carter had not just broken the record, she had destroyed it, setting a new bar so high it seemed almost impossible. And when they handed her the microphone later, under the bright stage lights and roaring applause, she paused for a long moment, letting the silence stretch out, and then said simply, "Respect the work, respect the dream, respect yourself," and stepped back because she knew words were powerful but deeds were louder, and her deeds were shouting across the country, stirring hearts, stirring imaginations, And even as the trophy was placed in her hands and photographers flashed 1,000 bulbs in her face, Nadine's mind was already moving forward, already thinking about the next challenge. Because she understood better than anyone that success was not a finish line. It was a beginning. It was a responsibility. And somewhere out there, she knew, another little girl was watching the broadcast from a worn sofa in a small house in a forgotten town, and that girl would see herself in Nadine Carter, would pick up a rifle, or a book, or a dream, and begin her own journey. And that, Nadine thought as she drove back home under the endless stars, was the real victory, the real target she had aimed for all along, and she smiled into the darkness, her heart steady, her spirit burning, because her story was far from over. It was only just beginning, and the road ahead, however long and lonely, was hers to claim. The world changed faster than Nadine Carter could have imagined after that night. The invitations poured in from competitions across the globe, from television networks offering interviews to companies waiving contracts and endorsement deals, but Nadine, true to herself, sifted through the noise with the same patient eye she used when lining up a shot. She chose only what aligned with her soul, turning down the glitz, the hollow fame, the easy paths. She spoke at schools where children who had never seen a rifle up close before looked at her with awe and wonder. She taught them not about shooting, but about discipline, about self-respect, about perseverance in a world that would often overlook them. She traveled to small towns and big cities, set up workshops that welcomed everyone regardless of where they came from or how they looked, because Nadine remembered what it felt like to walk into a room and feel invisible, and she had decided long ago she would be the one to change, that she would be the one to see them all and let them know they mattered, that they were enough, that they could be extraordinary. She stood on stages she once thought she would only watch from afar. She met the legends whose names she had whispered into the wind when she was young, and to her surprise they treated her with respect, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of genuine recognition of her unmatched skill and steady soul. The same Brett Lawson, who had once smirked at her back at Redstone, came to shake her hand at a charity match. His pride swallowed down his voice, gruff but sincere, and Nadine accepted it because she understood that real change was not about crushing the ones who doubted you, but about forcing them to see you clearly at last, and maybe even to change themselves. And so the seasons turned, and Nadine grew older, her hair streaked with silver, but her aim never wavered, her heart never hardened. Instead, it deepened like a river carving stone. And when the day finally came when she was honored in the National Hall of Marksmen, the first Black woman to stand among the giants of history, she didn't cry. She simply stood tall and nodded once in silent thanks to every ancestor, every teacher, every unseen hand that had guided her rifle, her hands, her spirit. She gave one last speech, not scripted, not polished, just her voice steady and sure, telling the crowded hall that excellence is not born, it is built, that history is not given, it is earned shot by shot, word by word, step by step, and that when one person breaks through a door, they do not do it for themselves alone, they do it to hold the door open for all who come after. And when she laid down her Winchester for the final time years later, carefully placing it in a museum where generations would see it gleaming under glass, Nadine Carter did not feel loss. She felt a fierce peace, because she knew the rifle would rest, but the spirit it carried, the dream it embodied, would continue to blaze in the hands and hearts of those yet to come. And as the sun set on the field behind her home, and the sky blazed gold and red and purple, Nadine sat on her porch, a warm mug of coffee in her hand, and 1,000 memories swirling around her like soft music, and she smiled, quiet and content, because she had lived her life as true as a straight shot across an open range, fearless, steady, faithful. And though the world would spin on and new champions would rise and fall, the name Nadine Carter would live not just in record books, but in every soul who dared to dream louder than the voices that said they could not. And somewhere out there, a little girl picked up her first rifle today, steadying her breath, squaring her shoulders, aiming not just for the target, but for her own place in the world. And Nadine smiled again, because she knew the cycle would never end, not as long as someone believed enough to pull the trigger and dare to hit the impossible. The end.